I am super excited to be joined today by Abby Glassenberg. Abby started her crafting career sewing stuffed animals and selling patterns while her children were born, and she has grown that business, which she calls While She Naps, into a successful blog, podcast, and a number of craft books. And in 2015, she co-founded the Craft Industry Alliance to unite makers and crafters who had built their business in much the same way as she had. So now she heads up that alliance, which aims to be a trusted source of industry information, creative inspiration, and community, which I love for craft professionals. So welcome, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Yay. So to get things started, could you just kind of give us a brief overview of how you got started into the craft industry?
Sure. So I've always been a creative person, always loved making things, loved taking art classes. I took home economics in 8th grade. My mom didn't sew. We didn't have a sewing machine at home, but I learned to sew there. I was terrible at it, but I thought it was really cool. And so I used some of my bat mitzvah money to buy a sewing machine. And so I kind of knew how to use it, but without someone there to help me, I wasn't so great at it. But that was kind of the beginning of the sewing story. And I took it with me after college. I did Teach for America. I lived in the Mississippi Delta for 2 years. I took it with me there, and then to graduate school up in the Boston area as well. So it was always sort of in the background, and I was always making things, throughout. But I was teaching middle school. I have a master's degree in education. I was a teacher, middle school teacher. So I was teaching middle school here in the Boston area. And then I had a child, and we knew I was going to be the stay-at-home parent. And so I'd always wanted to do that and, wanted to be a mom. And then when it finally happened, I was really bored really quickly. Taking care of an infant at home, we would go to story time, and then I was like, okay, I need more in my life. Unfortunately, at that time, blogs became a thing. I mean, who could have predicted? Like, that definitely wasn't on my radar, but it was around 2005, and my baby was born in 2004, our first child. So in 2005, I read about blogs in the New York Times. And it wasn't an article about craft blogs. It was just like, what is a blog? And I thought, oh, well, maybe there's blogs for people who like making things like me. So I looked around, and sure enough, there were. It was a really small, tight-knit community of craft bloggers worldwide. And I started following them and commenting. And, comments were a big deal back then. And there was a Flickr challenge. Flickr was where everybody shared photos. And there was a Flickr challenge where you could sew a stuffed animal based on a theme that the organizer gave you. And so at first I thought, oh, I'm gonna have to mail my stuffed animal to this person. And she was in Australia. I didn't understand like the whole, you can share the photo. It was all new to me. So I did that. It was called Month of Softies was the name of it. So I did that, and I started sewing stuffed animals, and that was really fun and kind of brought back my love of sewing. Same sewing machine from when I was 13. And so I would take my baby to the library for story time. And then after story time, we'd go upstairs and I'd check out all the stuffed animal sewing pattern books from the 60s and 70s and just sew my way through them and learned how to sew stuffed animals from that. And learned also through bloggers asking questions and being like, hey, why is it my machine doing this? Like trying to actually really learn for the first time. So that was wonderful. Started doing that. The blog came about. I was on date night with my husband. We were out for a coffee. It was pouring rain out. And I was like, I'm reading all these blogs. I feel like I could have one. Maybe I'll start one. And he was like, what are you going to call it? And I said, well, I'll call it While She's Napping, because it's just all the things I'm doing while the baby's napping. So I wrote that out on a napkin, and it looked like While She's Snapping. So I was like, I'll just call it While She Naps. So obviously no intention of starting a business. It was purely like hobby, mom, whatever. And so I was making origami, I was sewing the stuffed animals, I was gardening, I was baking cakes, I was doing all kinds of stuff and just posting it on there with this like digital camera, terrible photos, no idea what I was doing, no SEO, nothing like that. And anyway, over time, it really started to become more and more focused on the stuffed animals. So I really love sewing them. I started designing my own patterns. Etsy opened in July of 2005. I started an Etsy shop when Etsy was still in beta because I didn't know, I was using TypePad to make the blog. I didn't know how to code or sell anything.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, this is great. I can actually put something online and get these out of my bedroom because I had like stacks of stuffed animals at this point. So it was perfect for me. And so I started selling stuffed animals there and learning to design my own patterns. And so around, let's say 2009 or so, I was making stuffed animal birds. Specifically, they were almost like soft sculpture birds. They had like wire legs that were wrapped in floral tape, and they were like these little sculptures. They weren't really a stuffed animal at that point. And I'd made all these different kinds of birds. And I wrote a book called The Artful Bird, which was my first craft book. And it came out in 2011. And really, I had another idea for a book, which is what I originally pitched. And that one was to create a book that would teach you how to design your own sewing patterns for stuffed animals, because there wasn't a book. I kept going to Barnes and Noble and being like, I just need the one book that's going to show me how to design sewing patterns for stuffed animals. And it was never there. And so I pitched that idea actually as my first book idea, but I had no idea how to write a book. I mean, I Googled like write a book proposal, I had no idea. And so I wrote this like super complicated proposal that was like ridiculously over complicated. And I heard back from publishers right away. Actually, like an hour after I sent it out, the acquisitions editor Interweave called me and she was like, okay, I like the idea of doing a book with you, but this idea is too complicated. Why don't you just do a book of the birds? Because I was making those birds. And so I was like, oh, that's easy. Sure. Like, let's do that. So that's how The Artful Bird came about. But as soon as it came out in 2011, I had a second baby. And actually, at that point, I had a third baby. I had 3 children. And I was like, I now see how to write the book I had wanted to write in the first place. Like, I get it. I've been through the whole process and I can see now where I went wrong. So I wrote a much simpler, more straightforward book proposal. And I got a second book deal with Sterling Publishing to write Stuffed Animals from Concept to Construction, which was my second book. And that came out in 2013, still in print. Just got a royalty check from it the other day.
Woohoo!
$200. But anyway, I'm still getting royalties from it, and it's 2022, so that's pretty cool. I'm really proud of that book. That was like what I really wanted to do, and so that was exciting. And in the process of doing that, I had gotten in this rhythm of designing a new sewing pattern every 3 weeks because that's what was required to write the book. And so I took all my finished stuffed animals out of my Etsy shop and reloaded it with patterns. So after the book manuscript was done, I just kept designing. So I just, and then I started really having a business, because once you start selling digital products, it's passive income and you can actually make much more money, for me at least, than I was making with selling finished goods. And so I incorporated the business and got more serious about it. And my blog, I was still blogging at Walsh and Apps, but my blog started to shift as well because I was learning about business, which I, started out as a consumer. And then I wrote these books and realized, oh, not all book contracts are the same. And not all of us are being offered the same deal. And we need to talk to each other more about, what these deals look like. And, and so I started writing about that. And then I was also writing about Etsy, because I've been an Etsy seller, as I said, since 2005. And Etsy has gone through so many changes. And the way my podcast started was just Etsy had a town hall meeting with the old CEO, Chad Dickerson, and he explained that they were going to start accepting production partners for and kind of changing the definition of handmade, basically. And so I went to the town hall meeting virtually, and then I wrote this blog post covering it. And someone from Etsy reached out to me and they were like, hey, we saw your post and we'd like to talk to you more about this. And I was like, I don't really need to talk to her, but I could record the conversation and publish the recording, that I would do. And I was like, she'll definitely say no, because why would she say yes to that? And she was like, sure. So I didn't have any podcasts, anything, but I just recorded the conversation as an MP3. I found a host for it. I put it up. I got downloaded 8,000 times in 24 hours. And
Oh
I was
my
like,
gosh.
crap, this is fun. So that was the beginning of the podcast. And so I kind of did a few more interviews. And then I want to say it was January of 2014, I was like, okay, I actually need to like invest and get like a microphone and make a schedule and get consistent and all that kind of thing, get some theme music. So the podcast was there, and I was writing about business on the blog increasingly. And then one of my podcast guests, Kristen Link, who had the blog So Mama So, which was a really popular blog. She reached out to me one day and was like, hey, do you want to start a business conference with me? And at
Oh my
that
goodness.
point, I had
All right, wait, we got you. Now this is, hold on, slow down. Let me stop you there because there's so much already that I want to unpack about everything that you said. So before we dive into the next phase of your
yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll pause.
Oh my goodness. So like a million things going through my head about all that you said. First of all, the part that is played that sort of like cutting edge technology that we didn't realize was going to be cutting it, was going to be such big things later, played in your business is very interesting, right? You didn't know what blogs, you read about blogs in the New York Times. Suddenly you're like, hey, let's try this blog thing. You got into that community early. The same thing with the Etsy is like, not, who knew what Etsy was going to become, but you were on that platform early and an early adopter. And so those things all factor, and then the podcast, which we'll even get into further, but like all of those things, that is not only great, like kind of like kismet, right? That these things sort of came around and you were interested and curious enough to like dive into them, but also just, really speaks to the difference between building a business in 2005, in 2015, in 2025, right? I graduated from school in 2003, but I worked for 10 years in-house. So I was learning about the industry, and I was, obviously searching for jobs at times when I was transitioning jobs and stuff like that. But I wasn't really into this whole independent maker thing or independent artist thing until 2012. So, but by the time 2012 came around, I knew about blogs, and I started my website with a like HTML site, but then eventually Squarespace came around, and like Squarespace is so easy. And like, so all the changes now, business owners have so many like point and click options that make things so much easier that we and you and we, like so many business owners, have struggled with in the past. Right now everything is so easy, there's a tool for everything. So I just wanted to kind of like call that out, of that, like there are so many opportunities now that you don't have to even be an early adopter, because even as things grow, all these platforms that we use become better and better every day.
Absolutely. And I have a few things to say about that. One is I always try to keep that open mind and growth mindset. So the other thing about technology is it's constantly changing, right? You figure out the Instagram algorithm, and then they change it. Everything changes all the time. And I think there's a way to go where you feel frustrated by that and feel like angry about it when things change. And there's another way to go where you say, well, new things to learn. Now it's all about reels. Okay, let's learn to make reels. Like instead of sort of resisting, maybe now it's about TikTok. Let's explore what is TikTok. Let's just get in there and play, and keep your hands in the sandbox, and have like the attitude of, this is new and fun and creative, and I can learn how to do this, instead of being afraid of it. So I think that is a really, good attitude. The other thing is, because you're right, it is so much easier to do things now than it was back in the day. Even just uploading photos. Etsy in the very beginning, it was 5 pages of 5 screens before you could publish your product. Now it's all on one screen. I mean, so many things have been simplified and made easier. On the flip side of that, there's a lot more competition. You know, when I
Mm.
first started my craft blog, there were like 40 of us. You know, it's like it was, you knew everybody, and you could do postcard swaps and all this stuff. Like, it was very intimate. And now it's, you know, all kinds of people can start a business in one day. You don't really need anything to begin, and there's a lot of competition, and also it's much easier to look professional. So it's, you know, there's a lot of pressure to look very professional and to make everything polished, you know. I think there was
Mm.
a, as I said, like my photos were blurry, and I didn't write great titles for my posts that would come up in search and all that stuff. And now it's like the expectation is you're going to do it right if you're going to do
Mm.
it, you know? So I think there's a lot of pressure there as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I love both of those points. Yeah. The growth mindset thing is super important. And the idea of kind of just being curious about new platforms, and not like you have to invest your whole, like, oh, you have to figure out every new platform that comes along and you have to make it your important, you know, like a big part of your marketing or something like that, but just being curious about it and not feeling like, oh, this is another thing where the world's against me, the algorithm's against me,
Right.
right? So I do, yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I think yeah, it's, you're right about the competition as well. And it's easy to, I mean, I think, like, for example, I have a YouTube channel, as you know, you're currently going to be featured on it. And like, I've been doing it for 2 years now, and I'm not like I don't consider myself a YouTuber, because I do things so, like, what's the easiest way to get it done, right? We're recording on Zoom. There are ways to make things fancier and whatever, but we're not, you know, and when I record solo videos, they are not fancy and well lit. I mean, they're decently lit, but they're not like studio lighting, like whatever. And, you know, I just kind of go with like, it's the content that's the most important. What I'm teaching is what's important. And so I'm less polished than some other people, but, you know, I think as for crafters and artists and stuff like that, it's if you're selling a product or a pattern or whatever it is, it's like, you have to remember that what you're actually selling is what is the most important thing. It's, you want to look somewhat professional. You don't want to look totally like, you know, really bad, but just getting what you have out there and seeing how people react to that product is an important part of it. So
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree with that. And I
yeah.
think if it's quality is what's really important.
Yeah. And so kind of related to that is interesting when you were telling your story that while you started in 2005, you told that whole story, and then you got to 2011 and said, that's when I had a business. So that's really an interesting thing to me. Okay. So you were you were curious and you were interested and you were involved in the online world. And then in 2005, you were selling things on Etsy, but it was just, in your mind, it was pretty much just like a little side, you know, like kind of chump change. Is that what you because you had to sew everything individually. That's kind of your takeaway. So when you moved to selling the patterns rather than the actual products, that made things more streamlined and then much more profitable. Is that kind of?
Absolutely, because instead of selling one plush rubber duck, I could, for, you know, I don't know, even if you sold it for $99, which would be really high price for something like that, you can sell the pattern for the plush rubber duck for $10, right? And if you sell, you know, 10 of them,
You've made your money. Yeah.
right, you've made your, right, exact the same money, but actually you can sell it infinitely. So that same pattern with good photography and lots of samples and customers who've sewn it and shared, you know, through social proof, their product, their sewn items, you know, on Facebook or whatever it is, you can sell that, you know, you can sell 1,000 of them in a month or whatever. And then now if you have 44 patterns, you know, now you're really doing much better. And I also started to stock the specialty supplies that you need to be able to sew a really good stuffed animal that they don't sell in the big box craft stores.
Okay.
So things like special safety eyes that are fun and more exciting than the little black ones that they sell at Joann, rattle inserts and squeaker inserts. So you can make, you know, your baby
Interactive.
toys
Oh
make
yeah.
noise. I started selling like hemostats, which are like a medical tool that you can use to turn little tiny parts right side out. They're just like a little grasper
Mm.
and things like that. Actually, one of my friends from college is an emergency room physician, and he used to send, because they come in the kit that they open when they do surgery, and a lot of times they don't use them. And so he would send me all the extras.
Oh
And so
my
that's where I got my first hemostats from, but I now order them from a medical supply wholesaler and I sell those. So I started to sell the specialty supplies that support the patterns, and together that became, you know, it became a business where I actually had like money in excess of the amount I was spending for supplies.
Okay. So that, yeah, that is so interesting. And, you know, people talk about quote unquote passive income, which we all know by now is a myth. Nothing is passive. You're not. But the way I have heard it referred to also, and that I kind of subscribe to, is the idea of scalable income, right? So
I like
this is
that.
something you could scale. You can only make so many ducks in your 40 hours or 20 hours or 60 hours a week, however much time you're devoting to your business, however many hours you have, you can only do so many, but you can sell infinite amount of patterns. And that's similar to, you know, when I sort of maxed out on client work in 2019. Part of the reason I decided to create a really large course, I had some other smaller courses, but decided to create a large course is because I wanted something scalable. And I knew it wasn't going to be passive. It is not passive, but at least it's something that can be purchased by multiple people, rather than the one-to-one client work.
Yes.
So for that, you know, in 2011 and 2012 and around that time, I mean, you had your fingers in some different online things. What do you think were some things in those early days that helped build the popularity of your sewing patterns? Was it just that you already had you had traction as an actual maker, and so the patterns just kind of took off? Or what, do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the best-selling pattern, and it's still my best-selling pattern, is a baby lovey. So if you imagine it's like a pancake,
Oh yeah, I
okay,
know.
it's
I got
arms,
kids. I know what a
legs,
lovey is.
and it's got a stuffed little head on it.
Mhm.
Okay. So I made a pattern, and it was like 4 designs. It was like a bear and a lamb and a bunny and a dog, like a puppy, right? And it was basically all the same, different ears, different fabrics, and you can make it into all these different animals. And that pattern was immediately successful. And I then did a whole second set with 4 different animals, and then a third set with 4 other animals, like a monkey and all these other ones.
Yeah,
So I was
yeah.
like, why not make
Gotta capitalize on what's popular. Yeah.
Yes, and that was the cash cow from the beginning. And I came to understand that a lot of people come into sewing when there's a life event. You know, they have a baby, they want to make a quilt, or they want to make a stuffed animal, something heirloom that's going to
something handmade. Yeah. Okay.
be, you know, that the gift recipient is going to keep and really cherish. You didn't get it from Target, you know? And so that's the entry point for a lot of people. Maybe they learned to sew back in the day, and now they're like, oh, I want to come back to it. I want to do this. And so and it's the same thing with like a wedding, or, you know, there's just various life events that for somebody to want to make things. And so that was an interesting, you know, discovery. It was that. I think getting good photography was really important. You know, I learned to take pictures. I have a DSLR that I bought way back in the day. I got a light box. I spent a lot of time learning. I never was really a good photographer, and I started, you know, hiring that out. So I would send the samples to a real photographer and have them take photos, and I could afford to pay them a few $100s and get really good photos. And I saw with patterns that I had been trying to sell for years that when I swapped out the photos for professional photos, they immediately sold, you know, way better. So I started realizing, like, you know, you can hire a team. You know, I think in the beginning, I really thought, in order to do this, I have to do all parts of this. And then if I can't do all parts of this, then I'm not legitimate in this, you know, in doing this at all.
Gosh.
And I then realized that's ridiculous. Like,
Yeah.
just because I'm a DIYer doesn't mean I have to DIY everything. So
Yeah.
I hired somebody to make a logo. I hired the photography. Then I hired somebody who can do InDesign and actually create like a template and a layout for my pattern, so that when you get the pattern, it's not a Microsoft Word document. It's actually it actually looks the way you would expect something like that to look, or who could format it for print. And I started selling print patterns through distributors to quilt shops. So, being able to hire out meant I was able to go further, and realize that, you don't have to do everything yourself in order to be able to do this. And in fact, you probably shouldn't do it all yourself.
Yeah. And sort of going back to the platform thing of how things get easier for online business owners now, it's like now there's Fiverr and Upwork. So you can like finding someone who is low cost, budget friendly, help is a lot easier than it used to be when you might have had to be like scouring Craigslist or whatever, putting up ads in your local classifieds or whatever, whatever methods there were back then. So it's a lot, but it's still made so much more accessible by the power of the internet. So, man, I have lots of things I want to touch on here that I guess. All right, let's talk about the podcast thing briefly.
Sure.
Maybe it won't be too brief. I don't know. But, as you were just starting to explain how you kind of fell into podcasting in a way, because you were just like, I want to share this information about who you're talking, the Etsy head of Etsy or whatever, with your community. You were pretty early into the podcast game. And I remember being in, when I started my business, I remember like looking up like what kind of, and I don't sew, but looking up kind of like the genre of like textile design and surface design and everything. And your podcast was definitely one that I listened to, and I may have even pitched myself to you at one point in 2016 or something like that, because you were at the forefront. So, what do you have any kind of insight as to why that audio really appealed to you? Or, was it because you had started with a blog and it just felt like a natural evolution? Or what kind of brought that made you say like, let me be consistent about this?
Yeah, it was so interesting. And I can't say it was like an intentional decision at first, like that Etsy one definitely was not an intentional decision. It was really on a whim. I recorded another interview shortly thereafter with a woman who had designed sewing patterns for stuffed animals for many years and was quite elderly at that point. And I didn't think that I could I can't remember exactly, but I didn't think I could call her and interview her. And I asked if I could just record our phone conversation and publish that. And that's what I did. So there was a couple of like kind of random ones leading up to it. When I first started doing it, I was a huge podcast listener. And so I just really enjoyed that. And I could see that like the guy who founded Boing Boing, Mark Frauenfelder, I read Boing Boing a little bit, but I started listening to his podcast. And then after like 100 episodes, I was like, oh, I know Mark Frauenfelder.
Yeah.
I know about his family. I know about his life. I know about what he likes to do. And the way he structured his show is he would have two guests come on, they would chat, and at the end, they would recommend things that they were really enjoying. And so that's how I structured my show at the beginning. I was just like, come on. I brought two guests on at the same time. And yeah, they just recommended things toward the end that they were enjoying. It was basically exactly his model. Just to start out with, I kind of quickly dropped the two guests at once because it was like really hard to coordinate. And so it just became one guest, but we still do the recommendations toward the end. And, I think there's a big piece of me that's a journalist, and I really enjoy, interviewing people, getting their stories, and, a podcast is really an act of journalism. And so I think I really liked it for that reason. And honestly, it really helped me to improve my network, which was not intentional. I had no intention of that, but the result of it has been that I got to call everyone I was ever interested in talking to. I mean, similar to you.
I wonder, Abby, how I ended up on
I know. and
It's
talk to
just,
them.
you know, I said I probably, I don't know, but I probably pitched your podcast in 2016. That sounds like something I would have done, but here we are, and it took a while, but it's because I have a show now, right? Show,
Right,
whatever. I have a
exactly,
YouTube
exactly.
channel.
Because you have a show, you can call people and you can offer them an opportunity, and it's an easy opportunity. They
Mhm.
spend an hour, they talk about something they don't have to prepare for, they already know about, and you help to publicize it. And so as a result of that, I got to call everyone, and it's a very intimate thing. It's an intimate thing with the guests because you're asking, it's almost like a therapy session. You're asking them about their life story and their lives, and then it's also intimate with the listener. And so, you know, I found, like, I went to QuiltCon, which is the Modern Quilt Guild's show back in Savannah. I don't even know if it was 2018 or something like that. And I was walking after the show one day on the street in Savannah, just talking to somebody near the show convention center. And somebody turned around and tapped me on the shoulder. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, oh, you must be Abby. I recognize your voice.
Mm.
And, you know, I thought, wow, like, that's really powerful.
Powerful.
This
Yeah.
is a person who has been listening
Been in their ear for however long.
in their headphones while they go on a jog or do the dishes or drive places for years.
I love that.
And as a result of that, they know me and the way that I knew Mark Frauenfelder. And that's really powerful. So it's been great. I will say too, like, having a podcast is harder than it seems. There's a concept called pod fading. I don't know if you've ever heard of this concept.
No,
but,
I don't. I don't know a lot
it's
about
kind of
I
a
mean, I
great
listen to a lot of
term.
podcasts, but I don't know the
Yeah. So the pod fade is basically like you start out with a lot of gusto and excitement. And you're like, oh, I'm gonna have a weekly show and I'm gonna do all these things and I'm gonna have a guest, I'm gonna do a solo show and blah, blah. After like 10 episodes, you're just like, wow, this is way too much work. Like, it's so much work.
Yeah.
And if you want to send it out to be professionally edited, it's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And the vast majority, I don't have the numbers, but the vast majority of people who start a podcast don't stick with it. And for good reason. Like, it's really hard. And so my show comes out the first and third Monday of the month. And I started it that way because I was like, that's all I can do. I can only do the first and third Monday of the month. I can't do any more than that. So it stuck to that. And I'm at episode, I don't know, 230 or something now.
It was While She Naps, and now it's the Craft Industry Alliance podcast. Is that the name of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had to change it when I launched the new business. I moved a lot of things over. That was one of them. And it was scary to do. It turns out it wasn't super hard to change the name. We imported all the episodes. We changed all the artwork. We changed all the show notes. It was a job. It took a whole summer. And I didn't re-record the intro or anything like that. So if you go back to the older episodes, you'll hear me say it's the While She Naps podcast and might be a little confused, but I decided, as you had mentioned earlier, like, better is done is better than
perfect. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
That's I'm looking for.
Gotta do that.
I figured that's okay. We'll just keep moving.
Yeah, 100%. So, well, I definitely, of course, I want to dive into the Craft Industry Alliance, but sort of as a segue discussion question is, I'm really interested in this because I feel like this is starting to be a problem for me, or maybe not. I don't know. You know, you started your business as a sewist. Is it sewist or sewer?
Yeah, I like that term. I like sewist.
Yeah. Obviously blogging, podcasting, and it was all about your patterns and your Etsy shop and stuff like that. But then you started to have this community around you, and as we'll talk about, the Craft Industry Alliance, and as you're just saying, you even shifted over the name and everything of your previous work. And I was curious, kind of, how did you feel as you were transitioning into this new business? Because you were kind of getting away from what you originally started your business as. And I heard you even say something that I know resonated with me earlier, is how you were saying you started to get interested in you were blogging and you were blogging about sewing, and then you were kind of blogging about the business of sewing. And that's sort of at a place where I'm in. I can talk about surface pattern, but now I'm really more, in the world of a little bit beyond that, right? The business of surface pattern for sure, but maybe even beyond the surface pattern part and like the creative business part. And so, but that is, that's a tough kind of transition. And so I'm curious how you felt as you were making those changes. Maybe this is where you talk about how you built Craft Alliance, but just curious where you are about that.
Yeah, I think that's a real problem, and it's a real challenge, and it's scary to change, I think that for me, I felt like if I'm gonna, same thing. So I was talking about pod fading, same thing happens with blogging, or did back in the day when blogging was much more popular. Which is to say a lot of people started a blog, didn't keep going with it. And I felt like if I'm going to keep going with this, I need to allow myself to evolve, because none of us are static, and we all change. And in the end, I'm the person producing this. And so it's going to have to just be true to who I am, or I'm going to quit.
I love that.
And so, but I really enjoyed blogging, and I was home still with 3 kids, and it fit my life because, you can pick it up and put it down, and you can work when you need to work, when they're sleeping in the evening, all that. So I was like, I still want to be able to do this, and I'm just going to have to let myself change. So I started, everyone had always mentioned that it was important to have a newsletter. And I was like, well, I don't know what, and I would do these art shows, with my birds and stuff. And people would give me their card, and they'd say, add me to your newsletter list. And I would just throw their card away. I would be like, oh,
I love that.
Newsletter, like just check the blog.
I don't have time for this.
People didn't even know what a blog was. So they weren't going to come check the blog, So eventually I was like, fine. Just, I'll just try it. So in 2013, like middle of the year, I was like, all right, fine. I'm going to just figure this out. So I played around with the format over a couple of different weeks, sending out things. And eventually I landed on this idea of rounding up the craft industry news of the week and sending it out as like a curated list of links. And it had my own patterns in there and all the other stuff, but that was kind of the meat of it. And that was really popular. I had like 7,000 people on the list, and it was all the manufacturers and suppliers and retailers in the sewing industry were subscribed. And I was like, wow, this is cool. Like, I actually really enjoy writing the newsletter, and I'm surprised by how many of these industry players want this information. And I did have a couple of people email me. I can remember one in particular, like, I liked what you did before. I don't want you to do this. Like, I want sewing DIY tutorials. And I was like, fair point. Like, there's a lot of people doing that. And here's some recommendations, but it's not going to be me. Like, I'm sorry. Like, you can unsubscribe, no hard feelings. Like,
yeah.
So there were people who were alienated by it. But there were a whole lot of other people who were like, wow, this is what I've always wanted. Nobody's doing this. So I was kind of in the midst of trying to turn that newsletter into a paid product prior to Substack, right? There was no Substack. There was no way in MailChimp to make this happen. But I was in the beginning stages of investigating how to charge people for an industry newsletter. When, as we go back to my previous podcast guest, Kristen Link from So Mama So, reached out and said, do you want to start a business conference with me? And I had 3 little kids at home. One of my children has special needs. There was no way I was going to be able to even go to a business conference, much less start a business conference. I could not travel. So I was like, let's get on the phone. And I was like, I'm trying to start a paid newsletter. And so we kind of started talking, and we landed on the idea of creating a trade association. There were existing trade associations in the industry, but they were really focused on trade shows. So there was a yarn industry one, there's a quilt industry one, but really we wanted to provide all the great stuff you got at the trade show, but online all year round and accessible to everybody. And so what we saw from those trade associations was it was like an older model where you had to come together in person in order to get value. And that there was a whole lot of people for whom that wasn't going to work. And so we came up with this idea of the trade association. We decided to call it Craft Industry Alliance, and we were co-founders. We spent 10 months building the site and then launched in October of 2015. It was immediately successful. She had a huge list because she had her blog had 1 million hits a month, and it was a really big site. I had my list, which was smaller, but very engaged. And, we each put up $5,000 to invest in the business to get it started. And we made back our investment on the first day we launched. So it was really successful right away. Very much focused on sewing in the beginning because we both came from sewing. But over time expanded into specifically yarn kind of was next. So crochet and knitting, and now it's all craft sectors, but it took a while. And yeah, so we were like, we'll provide news coverage because that's kind of what I was doing in my blog. And what I realized from doing that was that there was nobody doing original reporting. There were very few people about craft industry news. And there wasn't, a great online B2B publication. And other industries have really good B2B publications. The interior design industry does, the lingerie industry does, all the industries do, and we deserve the same. So industry news was really important, hiring reporters, paying reporters to write stories. So we still do that. And then networking, obviously, but online networking, instead of just at the trade show, we were a trade association with no trade show. So being able to provide meetings. We were using Zoom way back when, long before the pandemic, to do meetups once a month. And we have a private Facebook group. And now we run mastermind groups as well. So now the networking is really important. And then education. I was a 6th grade teacher, as I mentioned, and Kristen was an 8th grade teacher. We both taught social studies. So education was always really important to us, and basically like professional development. So we hire an industry expert, and every month we host a webinar for our members, and it's recorded so people can come back and access it later on a topic that's highly relevant to people in this industry. So for example, in December, we have a color expert who's a color forecaster coming to do a webinar about color trends for 2023. So that's kind of an example.
Yeah. Ooh, I get tired thinking of it.
It's a lot of work.
For real, because I'm that all sounds so interesting to me, and so like I could see how I could get myself caught up in that, like I can see how that business might have evolved out of me in a conversation with somebody else, because it's like, oh well, we just need this, and the same first surface pattern, it's like, oh well, we need this, and nobody's doing this thing, and then but I also have the like, oh, but why do I have to do it? That feels like a lot.
I sometimes feel that way on a daily basis. So
okay.
Because I will say,
I mean, I was like I used to live in, before I moved here and started I live in outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. And before I started my family, I lived in New York City, and, I had a big group of friends. Now, once you move and then have kids, I feel like you don't have any friends for a while, but so I still feel like and then there was a pandemic, so I still feel like I have no friends now, but, I was always the one to be like organizing the happy hours and like having the parties and doing the things. And I do like to entertain. I still have like to throw a party and stuff like that. So I feel like that's so something that I would get caught up in, of like, yeah, let me just start a whole community and a whole alliance. But I've been resisting because I feel like, oh my gosh. So I give you so much credit. So the point of that is not
I was just going to say, my co-founder Kristen, so she had to leave the business in May of 2019 for personal reasons. We're still friends, but she had to exit, and I ended up buying out her 50% share and becoming the president by default. And so, it's a ton I have a great team. I will say, do not do it all alone. I have employees and contractors who I work with every day, but I certainly didn't intend to run it all by myself like this. And it is a lot of work.
So let's dive in a little bit for, I'm obviously not a craft professional myself, but I have a feeling there's some overlap because as to being sort of an independent artist, and a craft professional as far as struggles. So I'm curious, what are a few of the top things that you wish like you could change about the craft industry? Things that like, you know, I mean, not having a trade association where others did was something that you've already changed, but not asking you to do the work on this, but just curious of what are some things that you wish, like that you feel the craft industry is either lacking or you wish you could, you know, switch up for your industry.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that overall, there's just not a lot of money flowing around, and that's kind of the biggest issue. And I like to learn from sort of parallel industries about what's going on. So the food world, like food blogging, is in a lot of ways parallel, right? You've got lots of independent makers in their homes creating recipes, which is similar to a pattern, whether it's knitting or embroidery, whatever it might be, taking photos, publishing on their blogs. It's a little different because a lot of times they're monetizing through ads and affiliate. We're doing some of that, but there's lots of other ways in crafts, but there's some parallels for sure, and you've got big companies like Del Monte or whatever doing sponsored posts with content creators on Instagram and creating video. There's a lot of parallels there. So I listen to like the Food Blogger Pro podcast and have been a follower of Food Blogger Pro for a long time. And they kind of provide business skills for people in that industry. And one of the things that's always struck me that is really different is how much money there is in food. There's just so much more money. And whether that's ad revenue to be earned, affiliate revenue to be earned, sponsorships specifically from the food companies are huge, and they have such bigger budgets. And so, just overall, like just the flow of capital is just such a higher level.
Well, I can relate. Maybe you don't know, but I can relate because surface pattern design versus like graphic design and advertising design, that's like cash. I feel like they just have like those cash guns shooting everywhere. Whereas surface pattern design, it's like you're arguing to get $500 for a pattern that they're going to put on half the store's products, which is obviously very unfair. So yes, I relate.
Yeah, 100%. And it's not like there's no money in craft. I mean, it is a huge sector, but yeah, there's just not a lot of capital. And agreed, like people arguing over arguing over $1,000, fighting over $1,000, and it's just, I'm not really sure how that changes, but it affects a lot of things. Even when it comes down to selling a business, there's not a lot of buyers in the craft industry. There's not a lot of people to buy a business who can afford to buy. There's not a lot of investors. It's just I like to say to my husband, you can make $1 in the crafts industry. Like it's just not a lot of money. And that I think is something universally
frustrating.
Could change maybe over time, but it is frustrating. I'm not sure to the degree to which it's related to craft often being associated as women's work. Or
that's exactly how I feel about surface pattern design, because the surface pattern design industry is primarily female versus graphic design or advertising design. And so I often think that it's because we don't ask for more as a whole or consistently enough or whatever. We've been socialized in the way that we have been to not ask. I mean, I don't know, they missed me because I'll always ask, but you know what I mean? So we haven't been pushing it along the way for the last 20, 30 years. And that's exactly how I feel. So it's interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels in our industry.
Yeah. So I think that would be one thing I would change, is just if we had a lot more money, there's a lot more we could do. And people could stay in this and do this full time, and everything would be elevated. But obviously that's not an easy change. But
right. No, totally.
If I could have a big wish.
Yes. No, I know. I agree. And that's pretty much my main complaint about the surface pattern industry as well, as I said. And it's frustrating because, I mean, I think the general sort of undervaluation of the arts and how much like when you've been in this industry long enough, it's easy to kind of dismiss things because you're just so used to it. But the truth is, like, without my art, you don't have a greeting card, you have a piece of paper, like a blank piece of paper. Without, without my art, this isn't my art, but you don't have a shower curtain or a cool background, or this is a shower curtain, but it's also a cool background. You don't have like, everything around us is super boring without surface pattern. And the same thing can be said of crafts, like how everything, if everything was manufactured rather than some of those such beautiful handmade things involved in our daily lives, it's like how boring do our daily lives become, right? So many of the items that give us joy are those things that are handmade, handcrafted, really cleverly created by the craft professionals. So
we create things for people to express themselves in their spare time, and that's really worthwhile. So.
Yeah, there's so much value in that, and so it's the same problem that we have, and it's like, there isn't an easy solution, unfortunately, but it's tough. It's tough. So I would say, well, I have two questions. Let's see how can makers and crafters, first of all, how can makers and crafters get involved with the Craft Industry Alliance? Obviously, this sounds like an amazing place to hang out. You've got your webinars and everything. So is it pretty much just join, you can just register?
Yeah, it's a membership, and we try to keep it really affordable so that there's a 6-month membership and a 1-year membership for the individual maker. So if you're a small business, it's the 6-month membership is $59. It's really not super expensive. Hopefully it's something that you can work into your budget. And you just come to our website, craftindustryalliance.org, and join right there.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll definitely, of course, I'll have the links for all this in the description. And so then my last question is, I'm sure, especially since you run this alliance, you have a lot of newer makers in your midst who have questions on getting started, building their businesses. What advice would you give to those crafters who just put their newborns down for a nap and want something to express them? Maybe not the newborns, they have to get out of the newborn stage, maybe. Their toddlers down and now are ready to have their time and do their thing and build something lasting with their limited time. Do you have any advice for those newbies?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to go as far as advice. I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give is just to not give up. I think that persistence has been a really important part of my success. It's just like day in, day out, showing up and doing it like it's your job. And it will eventually become your job as your time allows. But, I feel like a lot of people just give up too soon, because there's days when it feels very unrewarding. You feel like you're shouting into a void and nobody's listening, or you get the angry email or whatever, the negative comment, and you can feel very down about it. But I think that, putting yourself on a schedule, like the podcast coming out the first and third Monday of the month, or, I used to blog 3 days a week, and those days were set in stone, and I had to come up with something to write or photograph or something for that day, and just really making sure that you do it consistently like that over a long stretch of time is really the key. And that sounds like such a slog piece of advice, but
no, but honestly, it's valuable. People need to hear it over and over again, because that is of course one of the things that I say too. And I mean, first of all, we can take the example of what you said of I started doing this in 2005, and then you only considered it a business in 2011. And that's, it's like, it can take a long time. These things take time. And you have to just kind of chip away at it. That's so important.
Yeah, no, agreed. You have to just keep on keeping on, because also it's really built on relationships. And when I was able to travel, going to the trade shows was great. And just those relationships take a really long time to develop. And
yes.
So when you are there and you keep being there and keep showing up for a long period of time, over time you get to know everybody, and that's really helpful. But it doesn't come in a year,
Yeah. Yes, I so agree. It's like the community is so important, and making those connections and building relationships in that way. And the same for the surface pattern industry, not only having the community of your peers to kind of help you with the slog, right? Help lighten up your day and talk through issues and whatever, but also, yeah, the art directors and stuff, to build those relationships. You do need to continually show up in their inbox with good art and show up at the trade show if you can, or make any kind of connections in any way you can. And the other thing I wanted to say, because you definitely made me think of this when you were telling throughout your story, is not just that you had the curiosity of like, let me try a new platform or whatever, but also the idea that you were willing to experiment and not be too attached to the outcome. Doesn't that, I mean, you tell me, but I think that maybe you were very attached to the outcome. I don't know, but but it's like the way you're talking about it, you're saying, oh, I was curious about these blogs. Let me just try a blog. Oh, I'm going to start releasing this podcast. I might do a newsletter that is paid. And in fact, it reminded me that in 2016, I had a subscription newsletter for like a year or 6 months or something. I had like maybe 12 subscribers, but it was like, I wanted to try that model. I felt like I had something to offer. 12 people agreed with me. But it's like, you build on these things. I forget about all that stuff that I've done to build and experiment and learn the lessons. And now that's why I'm scared of memberships, because I don't want to get dragged into doing things over and over again. But you know what I mean? It's the willingness to experiment and see where it takes you. So
I agree. I will say though that I'm one of these people who will never quit, and which can be kind of a bad trait. like, you know, I just so I started that newsletter, as I said, in like 2013. I've been sending that newsletter. It's now the Craft Industry Alliance newsletter, but I've been sending, it's essentially the same newsletter, that newsletter every single Wednesday since then. So we're coming on 10 years. I've never missed a Wednesday. Like,
that's wild.
So yes, on experimentation, but building it in, I guess
giving it a chance.
I don't want to like adopt it unless I can really commit, because once I start, I'm like committed to the end. So
I think, yeah, we're not quite at this. I am very much like that, but I also have learned like it's okay to so like my newsletter used to be all about trends. And so I would send a new trend board I think for a while I was doing it twice a month. And then I was like, well, I can only do this once a month. Let's be realistic, right? But I did that for years, and it was, of course, very popular. Well, not of course, but it was very popular. But then I was just like, okay, enough. Like so I still sent a newsletter, but I had to break it gently to people that it wasn't going to be a trend newsletter. I mean, I'll talk about trends, of course. I'll link to trends, but I'm not going to, and I do give updates twice a year now, but like, I'm not doing it every month. I just can't. So I have the ability to say like, all right, enough of this.
But still be able to keep going. So like you're saying, you still send a newsletter. It's not like you quit entirely. And I guess that's the key, like being able to evolve, but also sticking with it at the same time.
I love that.
Yeah.
Super important. Well, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I've learned so much about, I mean, what a interesting career evolution. And I can't wait to see how the craft, I mean, it's such a big thing already, but I'm just so curious to see how things continue to evolve. So I will put all the information about that in the description. And thank you for joining me, Abby.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Awesome. In the description of all my YouTube videos, I have a link to elizabethsilver.com/fresh, which will take you to sign up for my Surface Pattern Boss Toolkit. Once you sign up, you'll get an email to confirm, and then you'll get the password to get into this toolkit, where you can find all kinds of resources, surface pattern job guide, business advice, all kinds of trend reports, plus bonus videos, and access to the archives from my newsletters, where I have all kinds of cool links and useful creative business advice that you can check out. So I hope you go down to the link and join me. I'd love to have you. And while you're at it, hit subscribe and check out more videos on my channel.